Welcome to the Strong Youth Project, where our mission is to improve organized sport experiences for youth, parents, coaches, and other mentors via education and evidence-based practice.
Hi, and welcome to the Strong Youth Project podcast. I'm Emily, and today I talked to Mikel Joachim and Malorie Wilwand. Dr. Mikel Joachim is the Research Program Manager for Badger Athletic Performance at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and holds a research scientist position within her group. Her research primarily focuses on identifying risk factors for injury among distance runners, but she also regularly contributes to established lines of research on risk factors for hamstring strain injuries and recovery after ACL, reconstruction, and hip arthroscopy. She regularly publishes in top sports medicine journals and routinely presents at national sports medicine, physical therapy, and biomechanics conferences. Malorie Wilwand has her Master of Science in Sports Conditioning and Performance. She is currently a PhD student in exercise science at BYU working with the men's basketball team. She works full-time with the BYU football team as a research coordinator studying hamstring injuries. Today we talked about both of their research in sports with collegiate athletes and Mikel's research with youth on risk factors for both youth and collegiate athletes, especially emphasizing more overlooked factors like stress and sleep. We also talked about whether good movement mechanics exist and if they are relevant to youth, early sports specialization, and parents' and coaches' role in helping youth enhance their athletic performance. Okay, Mikel, Malorie, thank you guys so much for coming on the podcast today. Before we get started digging into more about sports injury, I just want to hear a little bit about yourselves, if you could each introduce yourselves.
Sure, I guess I'll take it away. My name is Mikel Joachim. I'm a research program manager and research scientist at UW-Madison, so I work with the Badger Athletic Performance Research Program. Primarily work with collegiate athletes, but we've started expanding our spectrum, so I've done a lot with high school and youth athletes as well, mostly distance running, but have a variety of sports and injury interests that I hope we can talk about today.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And Malorie?
I currently work as a research coordinator on a project that Mikel also works on, working with the BYU football team. I am also a PhD student, and I work with the BYU men's basketball team with research and strength and conditioning.
Okay, awesome. Thank you guys so much. I'm so excited to talk about the research that you both are working on today. I think it's going to be really interesting. The first question I have is directed a little bit more towards Mikel and about the research that you're doing at the University of Wisconsin. So can you tell us a little bit about that research?
Sure, yeah. So my main area of interest is injuries in distance runners, so primarily cross-country athletes. So I did a lot of work during my dissertation looking at risk factors for injury in high school runners, thinking that if we can keep high school athletes a little more healthy, that should eventually translate into healthier collegiate athletes. So we've done a lot with the collegiate athlete population as well, more looking at risk factors from things we can test in the lab, so running mechanics and bone health, as opposed to taking a different approach with our high school runners, partially because my work was during COVID, so we needed something that could be done remotely, but looking at more psychosocial factors, so how do they feel like they're sleeping, what are their stress levels, how do they kind of perceive their experience as an athlete. We also have a ton of other research going on, a very collaborative lab that I get to be a part of, which is awesome. So what Malorie alluded to is a hamstring injury study, and that's been going on for several years and has been collaboration with a few other institutions. We also do a lot with ACL reconstruction and hip arthroscopy, and are starting to look at how athletes fare after college as well. So really getting the full spectrum of athletic injuries and athletic performance.
Okay, awesome. I liked how you talked about using high school as a place to start for figuring out if that can either predict or help prevent injury for college. And from what both of you have learned, what is the most are the most important risk factors for athletic injuries in youth?
I also have research back in female runners, specifically like younger, like 18-year-olds. And something that I think is really important is making sure that they are eating enough to sustain both what they're doing with exercise and stuff, but also just to support their normal growth. So I think making sure that youth are eating good foods, but also enough to sustain the activities that they're participating in.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think we're finding that an athlete's whole body system being ready for the activities that they're undertaking can be really important. My work with the high school runners actually showed that changes in training volume were not associated with injury. And so I think a question that we were getting a lot was, how far should youth athletes really be running? Can they really be doing half marathons and marathons? And all my research didn't quite look at that far extreme, at least within organized collegiate or organized high school settings. The mileage they're doing seemed appropriate, or at least wasn't injury inducing. And so when we looked at things like stress and sleep, stress kind of started to peek its head out as a predictor of injury. So just being mindful of like what your athletes are experiencing and what the whole demand on them is, especially as a youth athlete where they're probably balancing a lot of social development and a lot of sport and school development too. Just being really mindful of where that athlete is at. Otherwise, we don't have a lot of great research available to us beyond sports specialization is really the thing that we're all kind of focusing on now, which essentially we're encouraging that athletes participate in multiple sports and that they don't overtrain in a single sport. So we have some good evidence, and we can certainly put some links in the show notes to some of the research that is supporting that, but it's still a really emerging area, and we actually don't have a great handle on risk factors in younger athletes right now.
Okay, interesting. And you guys both work with collegiate athletes too. So maybe from the research that you're working on right now, what are some of those risk factors in collegiate athletes that, maybe don't quite apply, or we can't extrapolate it to the youth, but are good to be aware of?
So, and some good parity is some of the sleep and stress metrics are panning out in our collegiate athletes as well. Dr. Drew Watson at University of Wisconsin and some of his students have shown that in a variety of sports, males and females. So that's something actionable. We can change travel schedules. We can change practice times to make sure that they're sleeping and that they're managing their stress. From a more biomechanics perspective, which is the hat I typically wear, and runners, there are a variety of running mechanics that can contribute to certain injuries. And then our project's focusing more on muscle and tendon health. I think looking at the characteristic of the muscles and the tendons related to certain athletes and how they use different body parts for their sport will start to emerge as some good risk factors too.
And to contribute to what she is talking about, I just want to share a real life example. So for example, with the BYU men's basketball team, the players have this software that they're able to track their sleep schedules. And this software is able to tell like how well they slept and how long they slept. And then every day the players do a pre-participation screening, and it just asks questions like, how are you feeling? How is your stress? How is your levels of soreness? And then the coaches use that information to dictate practice. So if they're noticing a trend in the players that either they're not sleeping really well or also that they're experiencing a lot of soreness, maybe they scale back that practice for that day or the next day to give that time for the athletes to recover. So I think similar things could be done with the high school athletes as well, just like high school coaches checking in with your athletes, seeing how they're doing with their stress levels or also how they're sleeping. That can make more educated choices about practice, maybe intensity that day.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I definitely think that I hadn't thought about stress and as much being a risk factor for injury, but it's interesting how potent that seems to be so far in the research that you guys have been doing. And sleep as well. I've always heard that's important, but I know that sometimes that can be really hard for especially people in high school and college to focus on getting enough sleep, whether it's because of social or homework. So that's definitely a really important note for youth athletes. Thank you. Kind of moving on to not only what the youth athletes can do, but also I think it's important to recognize the parents' role in helping youth athletes. So what are some things that parents or coaches can do to increase the likelihood that youth sports are safe? I know that Malorie mentioned just maybe dialing back the training that day based off of how athletes are feeling sleep or stress-wise, but maybe what are some other things that they could do?
I don't think parents and coaches are currently set up for success in this area. I think such an emphasis has been put on winning and athletic performance and preparing people for college or club sports that the system doesn't really support good decision making right now, unfortunately. But I do think that if we can start to chip away at parents at least understanding the importance of sports sampling or being open to letting their child play multiple sports. But again, they're not set up for success. There's challenges financially, there's challenges logistically of making all these different events, a lot of competing interests. But I think as much as we can continue to repackage the specialization research in a way that is digestible quickly and impactfully for our parents and coaches, I think that's the best that we can do right now. If you ask anyone in sports science, they'll say specialization is bad. And when you ask the parents, they say, yes, specialization is bad. But then when you flip the question and say, would you let your child or support your child like foregoing one experience in a single sport to facilitate multiple sports, they say no. And coaches say the same thing. They say specialization is bad, but I don't want my athletes doing multiple sports. And so it's like you can't have it both ways. So as much as we can give real data in terms of what the impacts of specialization are, I think that's a good move. Educating them on good movement patterns or things to screen for in terms of more of this like athletic movement literacy. Like we may be setting athletes up to just not move very well if they're only doing one sport. And then another thing I think is really critical and hard for parents to stomach is like your child is probably not playing collegiate sports. That's the reality. It's just a math problem. We have so many youth and adolescent athletes and not enough collegiate sports spots. It's only going to get worse with the climate of collegiate sports right now, of them cutting sports and reducing roster sizes. So being mindful that collegiate sports, a scholarship, is realistically not the end game. Your student getting or your child getting good mental health benefits and creating lifelong friends, hopefully, and having really good experiences early in life is really the goal. But again, that's really challenging to tell a parent that, like, I know you think your kid is great, but this is probably going to end in high school. But I think we need to be overemphasizing or better emphasizing the mental health benefits and the physical, just creating good habits physically, not the success in this sport long-term into college and beyond, because that's just not the reality for 98% of youth athletes.
And I think just to add to that, if you're able to build like those relationships and this love of movement, then it can help them it'll carry throughout the rest of their lives. Then hopefully they're still able to be healthy and active, even if they're not college athletes.
For sure. It's hard to see the long game, and I totally get that. And it's on us to figure out ways to communicate that better as researchers and people who care about these athletes being healthy throughout their lifespan.
I think also to add to that, I mean, if parents are listening to this podcast or watching this on YouTube, I'd say they're invested in learning and also being really educated about their children and their involvement in sports. So I just want to remind parents, that you're your biggest advocate for your child. And sometimes that's maybe difficult decisions. And just being confident in those decisions. It made me think of when Mikel was talking. When I was in high school, I had a late game and I really wanted to go lift weights with my team the next morning, and my dad wouldn't let me, and I was so angry at him at that time. But now I recognize he was putting my health first and recognized that I needed a break. So sometimes parents have to be an advocate and have hard decisions and hard conversations.
I mean, parents and coaches, they have a very, very important role, and they have a huge effect on the students and the kids that are doing the sports. And so I think that you guys make a good point. It's really sad that so much emphasis is being put on and pressure being put on youth to be a college athlete. Maybe that's their dream, but maybe that's something that's been put on them. And sometimes it can be unrealistic, or it can just lead to unhealthy obsession even with the sport. So I was thinking about what you were saying about early sport specialization and how it has negative effects. And I was wondering if you could tell us some of the specific negative effects of early sport specialization in youth.
Yeah, so some of the best data we have shows that athletes burn out quicker, so they may choose to withdraw from sport or just have other mental health detriments. I think there is a caveat, though. I mean, I was a single sport athlete for most of my life growing up, and I would not say I had adverse effects of specialization, but I was a single sport athlete because it was just the sport I enjoyed playing the most. I had the most friends, and so it was the most fulfilling to me. So I personally decided not to play other sports because they weren't fun, which is a very different sort of constraint on the athlete compared to, I feel like I can't play another sport because I'm not going to make the team or I'm not going to be able to be successful. So there are certainly scenarios where you can have positive sports specialization, but I think those are the exception and not the rule. So what we're seeing is burnout's a lot higher, sport participation ends a lot sooner, especially for women. They might self-select out of sport a little bit sooner. and injury rates are higher. These athletes are, we think, getting some overtraining and overuse injuries where they just aren't letting their tissues rest. They aren't using different tissues frequently enough, and so it is actually like physically resulting in some adverse effects, unfortunately.
As you were talking, Mikel, I was thinking about your comment earlier about being not set up for success. Because if we want them to participate in other sports, but yet the coach is advocating for spring practices, or you guys should engage in these other activities when maybe it's an off season for that sport, that makes it so much more difficult. Because then the athletes feel like if they want to accomplish this, dream or go after to be the best, then they feel like they have to engage in all of it.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, as you're saying that too, with the off season, we do have this interesting case study of football athletes because there is no opportunity to play football in the off season. There's not club American football, so they have to play other sports. And while there's a variety of sports injuries in football, for sure, I'm not saying it's an injury-free experience, I don't think we see some of the same manifestations of specialization in football because they can't specialize. It's not an option for them, as opposed to hockey and soccer where you could play club and play travel and all of that. So, by the time you get to college, if you ask collegiate football players if they've specialized, 80% of them or more have not. And you ask the other sports and it's flipped, like 90% of every other sport has specialized. And so I think we see our football athletes, potentially, anecdotally, this is just, my sense, is they don't have all the burnout and they don't have, they have contact injuries for sure, but they don't see some of these more overuse injuries that we see in other sports. And that could be because football is a very unique sport. It could be because these guys aren't able to specialize. It's just not available to them. So I think we could do a little more digging and use them as a little bit of like a control group to see if some of these adverse effects really are mitigated appropriately too.
And when is the good time to make that? Because at some point, maybe they could specialize because if obviously in college they're going to be, is there a sweet spot when they can be like multi-sport and as they're getting closer to college?
I don't know. We don't know yet. I think just specializing as late as possible is probably what we'd advocate for, but by the time you get to college, you're specialized for sure.
Yeah.
But, if you can delay that as much as possible through high school, I think that's probably great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. I think that it's really interesting that it has, like football, for example, shows so many differences from specializing and the amount of people that specialize versus other sports. And it's also interesting that a lot of that, like we talked about earlier, that pressure of specialization does come from parents and coaches doing off-season practices or travel team or club team in high school and all the different types of teams you can be on or tournaments that you can play in. And I imagine that lots of parents, coaches believe that that's the best way to facilitate athletic performance. But a question that we have for you at the Strong Youth Project is maybe what are some better ways that parents and coaches can facilitate athletic performance in youth?
Something I was thinking about is in the strength and conditioning world, there's this thinking about when kids are young, when they're in a weight room lifting, it isn't for elite performance. That's not why they are engaging in strengthening. It really is just to have basic movement. So just like the foundations of movement and making sure that these children develop in their body and know how to move their bodies well and also adjust to just growing. So I think that should be a focus, is just the foundations. Obviously when they're young, I think it should be play and fun, and then as they're getting older into junior high and high school, just like the foundations of good movement. Because at that level of high school, they're not going to be Olympians yet. Majority of them are not. So that's not what their focus is. It's not supposed to be elite performance. It really is just building the foundation. And then if they are able to move on in college, that's when they'll get the training to be more performance driven. Or that foundation, if they don't go to college sports, will carry them throughout their lifetime. So I think just foundation of good movement while they're in high school is important.
And does that foundation of good movement that is completed in the weight room for high schoolers and younger athletes, is that contributing to injury prevention or protection against injury?
I would say if athletes are in the weight room, I'd say the focus should be on strengthening their bodies and becoming more coordinated with their growing and adapting bodies. But you have to be very aware that it's not leading to overtraining. Just be aware of balancing in the weight room or extra activities on top of practice. So if an athlete's already doing a lot of practice, let's say for basketball, I wouldn't advocate for tons of time in the weight room during that season, but maybe in the off season, that'd be a better time to, strengthen their bodies through the weight room.
And then that time in the weight room, strengthening their bodies, does that help them prevent possible injury just in other ways versus like maybe you get injured because muscles or bones are weak? Does that time in the weight room help them prevent injury maybe during the regular season?
Yeah, absolutely. You can, I'd say in the weight room, you can help your tendons just adapt through different training exercises, or also strengthening the bones as well through like plyometrics, and then strengthening your muscles as well, which then can later prevent injury, just better body control. So your high school coaches don't need to be strength and conditioning coaches to help these athletes. They really can just use basic squatting and just basic movements, and I think it will lead to growth and strengthening of the muscles to help injury prevention.
Yeah, I think you bring up some great points related to, again, this like idea of movement literacy. So I think from a theoretical framework, sometimes we think injuries are because they had to do something unanticipated or respond to some unusual stimulus, be it like someone making contact with them, or especially in an adolescent state, like a lot of times the fields you're competing on aren't in the best shape, so you have to be kind of responsive to your environment. And so doing a variety of movements in the weight room and by playing other sports theoretically makes your body a little more flexible and a little more confident to do these movements that maybe you weren't pre-planning. Again, this is all like pretty theoretical, but I guess none of us have seen a downside to having more flexibility for how you do your movement. I also think there is some minimum level of strength required to do any task well, be it standing or driving your car, all the way up to athletic performance. And so that's where the weight room comes into play in terms of establishing that minimum amount of strength to be successful. But there's also the reality of like the peak strength that you create in the weight room from a neuromuscular perspective. A lot of athletic activities happen too quickly for you to reach that peak strength. And so to your point about plyometrics and just getting a diversity of movements and fast movements and slow movements should improve your athletic performance by prepping your system to have maximal strength when you need it, to have fast strength when you need it, and just having a lot of options available to you to complete the task that is playing your sport.
Okay, awesome. So from what I understand, you guys are saying that just diversifying movement is one way to help athletic performance, and just making sure that all of these young people that are performing in athletic sports, that they have I liked the word movement literacy, or the phrase movement literacy, because that just shows that it's about, okay, do they know how to use their body? Do they know how to be coordinated? So is that an accurate depiction of what you guys were saying? Yeah,
and I think the one other thing that you had brought up, Mallorie, that I just wanted to piggyback on of what coaches and parents can do related to maximizing athletic performance is actually rest. Like, I mean, exactly what you said about your dad saying, you can't go to this lift, you need to rest. And so that, I think, is a tangible thing that could be actionable, that doesn't necessarily require you like skipping something or not doing the camp or not doing, whatever extra thing, but just being mindful of how you program your day and what a rest day looks like. It could be as simple as like, go for a walk around the block or a jog instead of hitting the weight room again. And so just zooming out a little bit and maybe looking at like, what does this next month look like? And kind of where can we build in some rest, or where can we build in some down days? Could be as beneficial as adding weight room time, honestly.
Oh, yeah. And just parents and coaches letting the young athletes know, even if they're super enthusiastic about their sport, that rest is necessary and rest is important for them to continue to perform well.
Yeah.
So awesome. Thank you. And so we talked a little bit about like movement literacy and movement in the weight room. So I wanted to ask about kind of movement mechanics. And according to research that you guys have read or are working on, is there such a thing as good movement mechanics related to maximizing athletic performance or decreasing youth athletic injury risk? And if so, is there a way for a coach and parents to ensure that they have good movement mechanics, the youth athletes?
Honestly, this is probably kind of an interesting or surprising answer. I don't think we know what good mechanics are, right? A long time ago, when ACL research first started, we all thought that excessive knee valgus was a problem, or reduced peak knee flexion was a problem. And while I think no one would advocate for extreme knee valgus or really limited knee flexion during a jump landing, those certainly weren't the silver bullets we thought they were in terms of identifying injury risk. And so I think we've kind of learned that there are multiple ways to be successful and multiple ways to be healthy. And I would argue that whatever movement pattern is not resulting in you getting injured is probably a good movement pattern for you. With my running biomechanics background, I can certainly say that there are some thresholds of if your peak forces are too high, we would start to throw some caution at that. Or if you're bouncing too much while you're running, we would start to maybe throw some caution at it. But to say that there's like one good goal movement pattern for all football athletes or all runners to be successful and injury-free and performing at a high level, I think we'd be really short-sighted to say that we know what that is. I also, in working with collegiate athletes, some of our most atypical running mechanics we've seen or most asymmetrical mechanics we've seen are in our top runners. So it's hard to knock that movement pattern if they're staying healthy and they're performing really well. And so I think educating people broadly on, not landing with your knees locked out, I think we've all agreed that that's bad. And some kind of like big picture things is helpful, but chasing down this ideal movement pattern or teaching only one movement pattern is really not going to do much for performance or injury prevention, in my opinion.
And I think you had a really good point when you were talking about that athlete that, maybe he's an elite runner, but he has this weird form, but you said that he didn't have injury. I think that's the key point is if your child is expressing these symptoms over and over again, maybe that's time that you need intervention. Maybe your child can dictate the path that you take of like, hey, you're always having your hip flexor injury, maybe that's something to look into rather than be preventative with it as well.
Yeah, I think you could waste a lot of time trying to fit them into a box, but the movement mechanics that keep you healthy and doing your sport at the level you want to do it at are probably the ones that you should have.
To add to that, I was also thinking about post-injury and how that can change mechanics as well. I personally had an ACL injury in high school, so 10 plus years ago, and I still have to consciously not just shift to one leg when I'm standing. So I think just being aware of mechanics and how that can change later on and being intentional there, that's something that I personally am aware of that I have to work on with my mechanics.
Okay, interesting. So we have the perspective that, movement mechanics, while maybe it can be helpful for people who are having recurring injury or have already been injured, there's really no one like perfect movement mechanic that's going to be good for all athletes. And so it's going to be different. And so they should just listen to their bodies and try to figure out what's best for them. Is that my understanding correctly?
Yeah, I think that's spot on.
Okay, so the last question I wanted to ask you guys is a little bit, related to your research, but a little bit unrelated to the other things we've been talking about. And I know I'm certainly interested in this as a female who's really interested in sports and just research in sports. So how has it been for both of you as women in the sports research field? And just tell me a little bit about your experience and what it's been like.
Sure. For me, I feel very fortunate. It's been fantastic. I think through academia, we've heard a few horror stories or, just how it can be a little bit tougher as a woman to find opportunities. But I think I've been extremely fortunate that I've had colleagues and mentors and advisors and bosses who just advocate based on good work, and they don't really advocate based on, is the person in front of the male or female or anything like that. But I think it does provide some really interesting perspectives doing the research in terms of making sure that women are always represented. I think I've been really lucky to always have access to males and females in every study that I've done. I don't think I would ever do a study excluding one or the other. I think making sure that you're mindful of sex effects or the potential for sex effects is critical. And I think a lot of research that focused on just males for a long time or ones that said, oh, we've done too much in males, let's only do females. I think both of those are missing the mark, and kind of integrating both of them into our research has allowed us to answer more interesting questions or better understand existing questions. And so I think just having some female perspective to bring to the equation and using that to evaluate how we design our testing protocols, what questions we ask if we have a survey that's more psychosocial in nature, has been really interesting and really helpful.
And on the sports science side of things, I personally am working with 2 men's teams. And so it is unique because I'm often the only woman in the room. So at football practice, there's not a ton of females out on the field. So that is just something that, one, I've had to get used to a little bit, just being comfortable being in that situation. And also because it is new to them as well, those coaches and stuff, just having good communication about, what's expected of me or how things may be a little bit different. So I think that women are making huge strides, though, in all sports, of being able to be there and adding and contributing and being a valuable member.
Thank you. I definitely feel like you both have lots of awesome and amazing perspectives that we need in the sports medicine world. So thank you both so much for coming on the podcast, and thank you all the listeners for listening, and we'll see you next time.